My daughter sold my lake house for a 200K yacht party for her MIL. I wasn't even told. I stood on the dock that night, watching lights dance across the water, and realized my lake house was gone. Not sold to save a life, not to pay a debt I owed, but traded away for a $200,000 yacht party for my daughter's mother-in-law. They never even told me. The house my late husband and I built with money from a tragedy that should have broken them, not me. The same woman he once pulled from a sinking boat now toasted champagne under the stars, while I stood in the cold with empty hands. I thought I had been silent to keep the peace, but maybe my silence was the gift they counted on. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Subscribe if you know what it feels like to be treated as a burden, even when you carry the whole family on your back. To understand how I found myself standing there that night, you have to understand the life they tried to take from me. It began with the mornings. Yesiun. The mornings by the lake always felt like they belonged to me alone. The water at that hour was still enough to mirror the pale pink of the sky, and the air carried the scent of pine mixed with a faint trace of wood smoke from cabins that kept their fires burning through the night. I had learned every ripple of this shoreline over the years, and could tell when a family of geese had passed before sunrise, or when a storm was rolling in by the way the clouds hung heavier over the far ridge. That Tuesday started the same as countless others. I slipped into my worn cardigan, one my husband used to say made me look like I was wrapped in an old quilt, and stepped onto the back deck with my coffee. The mug was warm in my hands, a steady comfort against the chill. Somewhere near the North Bend, a loon called out, its echo stretching across the water. I always stopped to listen when that happened. It was a sound that had outlasted storms, droughts, and more than a few changes in my life. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked steadily, pulling me toward my morning shift at the town library. After my husband passed, the library became my anchor, a place where the simple rhythm of sorting books and helping neighbors grounded me in a life that still mattered. On my way, I looked back at our house, Tahoe Sunset, its weathered boards holding the story of how we used an insurance settlement to build something beautiful from pain. Driving into town was part of that same comforting routine. Through the bakery window, I spotted Walter Pike lost in his morning crossword. He lifted a hand in greeting, and I returned it with a smile. Another small piece of the quiet life I believed was unshakable. The day moved along the way most days did. By lunchtime, the sun had burned away the mist, and the lake outside the library windows glittered like someone had scattered a handful of coins across its surface. A few tourists wandered in to ask about the local trails. I pulled a pamphlet from the rack, pointing out my favorites and warning them about the switchbacks that could turn a casual walk into a calf burner. Around 3, I locked up and headed to the small historical museum across the street where I volunteered twice a week. I had always been drawn to the old maps and black and white photographs of the town in its early days. There was something steadying about looking at those faces, knowing they had lived through hardship and joy just the same as we do now. That afternoon, I was cataloging a box of letters donated by the Dawson family when I noticed a familiar voice in the next room. Tessa Quinn, the real estate agent who had been working the lakefront properties hard all summer, was chatting with the museum director. Her tone was friendly, almost casual, but I had lived long enough to recognize the energy of someone circling what they wanted. When she spotted me, she came over with a smile that felt a little too rehearsed. She complimented the museum, then, almost as an afterthought, asked how long I had owned Tahoe Sunset. I told her it had been decades, long enough for the boards on the deck to memorize the shape of my feet. She laughed politely, then tilted her head and said the market had never been hotter, that a house like mine could fetch more than I probably imagined. I told her I wasn't selling. Not now, not ever. It was the kind of statement I didn't need to raise my voice to make. She nodded, said she understood completely, but her eyes lingered just a second too long, like she was already picturing a listing photo. That evening, I returned home and settled on the deck with a book. The sun was sliding low, painting the water in streaks of gold and rose. My neighbor's dock creaked under the weight of two teenagers hauling a cooler toward a small fishing boat. Across the lake, I could see the lights of the yacht club flicker on. I remember thinking how quiet the water was that night, how the air felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't know it then, but that quiet was the kind you only notice when something is about to change. It settles over you like a blanket, comforting and heavy at the same time. After dinner, I rinsed my plate and leaned against the sink, looking out the kitchen window toward the dock. The reflection of the moon was beginning to shimmer on the surface, and for a moment, I felt a wave of gratitude for this place, for the life it had held together for me all these years. I had no idea that somewhere, beyond the calm of the lake and the safety of these walls, someone else was making plans for it without my knowing. It would be weeks before I understood how far those plans had gone. That night, all I saw was my home in the fading light, steady and sure, the way it had always been. And I believed, without question, that it would stay that way. The first time I saw the lights from the yacht that night, I was still stacking kindling by the back door. The glow came from across the lake, brighter than anything I had noticed there before. The sun had dipped just far enough to let the evening take over, and the reflection of those lights stretched in long ribbons over the water, moving gently with the current. From my deck, I could hear faint music, not the kind played at the local bar on weekends, but something richer, polished, layered with the sound of laughter. I set down the last bundle of wood and stayed at the rail for a moment, my eyes adjusting to the scene across the water. The yacht was larger than anything I had seen on Tahoe in years, sleek and white, with two levels strung in gold lights. Figures moved in clusters, raising glasses, leaning in close to talk. It was the kind of party you could smell even from a distance, if not for the pine and cool air between us. The music carried just enough for me to make out a slow, steady beat under the hum of voices. The sound of an engine starting on my neighbor's dock pulled my attention for a moment. Two small boats pulled away, their lights bobbing toward the far shore. One of them veered toward the yacht, slowing as it approached. I watched as someone stepped onto the lower deck, greeted with applause and the flash of cameras. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, but then I saw her, my daughter, Sloane, in a dress the color of deep bronze, her hair swept up the way she used to wear it for her high school formals. She smiled in that careful, camera-ready way, the kind that holds steady even when the laughter behind it is already fading. Next to her stood her mother-in-law, Veronica Bennett, wrapped in something pale and shimmering, a flute of champagne in her hand. Even from across the water, I could tell she was holding court. Guests leaned in toward her, their postures easy, as if they were in the presence of someone worth impressing. I stayed where I was, leaning slightly on the rail. There was no reason for me to be surprised they were together. Sloane had always made an effort to be close to her husband's family, especially since Graham's work often pulled him into long stretches away from home. What I could not quite place was the reason for this gathering. It was the middle of the week, the air barely warm enough for an evening out on the lake, and yet here they were, celebrating something with a kind of extravagance our small community rarely saw. The music shifted, and a low burst of fireworks flared over the water. Nothing grand like a 4th of July display, but enough to draw cheers from the deck. My eyes caught on a detail near the top rail of the yacht. A banner, just faintly visible in the light, with the words Tahoe Sunset Gala printed in a curling script. The name landed like a stone in my chest. Tahoe Sunset was more than just a name to me. It was the name my husband and I had chosen for our home, a name we had painted ourselves on a wooden sign and hung above the front porch. I told myself it might be a coincidence. Maybe they simply liked the phrase. Maybe they did not even think of it as connected to me. Still, my hands tightened on the rail as I watched another burst of light illuminate the crowd. The banner shifted in the breeze, catching the glow before settling back into shadow. Across the water, Sloane and Veronica were moving together now, speaking with a tall man in a tailored jacket who gestured toward the upper deck. They laughed, the kind of laughter that tilts the head back just slightly, and the group moved out of view. I stayed a little longer, letting the cool air wrap around me. There was no point in speculating about what they were doing, I told myself. People had parties. People used names without thinking. Not everything was meant to hold a deeper meaning. Still, I could not quite shake the way my daughter's hand rested lightly on Veronica's arm as they stepped inside. I had seen Sloane do that before when she was younger, a small, unconscious gesture reserved for people she wanted to please. When the music faded into something softer, I went inside, closed the sliding door, and drew the curtains against the view. In the quiet of my living room, the faint thump of the bass became nothing more than a background hum. I made tea, set it on the table beside me, and picked up a book I had been meaning to finish. But my eyes kept returning to the window, to the place where the reflection of those lights had danced across the water. By the time I finally turned out the lamp, the party was still going. The hum of it followed me upstairs, weaving its way into the stillness of my bedroom. The sound was soft but steady, like a reminder I could not yet interpret. I told myself it was just a gathering on the other side of the lake, a night that would pass without touching me. I believed it then, because there was no reason not to. I did not yet know how wrong I was. 2 mornings after the party, the lake was hidden under a pale fog, the kind that made the shoreline vanish just a few feet from the dock. I was clearing the breakfast dishes when the mail truck pulled up at the end of the drive. It was unusual to see it so early, and even more unusual for the driver to walk the length of the gravel path instead of leaving the bundle in the roadside box. He handed me a large manila envelope, the kind used for official documents, and gave a polite nod before turning back toward his truck. I carried it to the kitchen table, the paper slightly damp from the mist. My name was printed neatly in the center, and the return address belonged to the county recorder's office. I opened it without thinking much, expecting perhaps a tax notice or some routine update on property lines. Instead, a packet of documents slid onto the table, clipped together in a way that made my hands still. The first page was bold with its heading, a property transfer confirmation, listing Tahoe Sunset as the subject property. My eyes moved over the text once, then again, as if reading it twice would correct the meaning. The house was no longer in my name. The new registered owners were listed as Graham and Sloane Bennett. The transfer date was the same as the night of the party. I flipped through the rest of the packet, each page making my chest tighten. There was a record of sale, a notarized statement, and a scanned signature that was meant to be mine. It was in my handwriting, at least in the way it curved and slanted, but something about it felt off. The ink in the copy was sharp, too perfect, as though it had been lifted from another document. The more I stared at it, the more I felt the ground shift under me. I reached for the phone and called Sloane. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright at first, then careful once she heard mine. I told her about the envelope, about the transfer papers in my hands. There was a pause on the line long enough for me to hear the faint background noise wherever she was. She spoke slowly, explaining that it was the right decision, that the house had become too much for me to maintain. She said she and Graham had taken care of everything, that I did not need to worry. I listened, letting the words pass through me without catching hold. When she finished, I told her I had never agreed to sell, never signed any papers. Her tone shifted, softening in a way that was meant to sound reassuring. She said I must have forgotten, that it was all handled for my benefit. The conversation ended without a clear resolution, her last words trailing into static as she said she would call me later. I sat at the table long after the line went quiet. The documents lay in a neat stack before me, the county seal embossed at the bottom of each page. It felt strange how official the theft of something could look when dressed in the right paper and ink. Later that afternoon, I drove into town and stopped at the bank. The teller, a young man who had grown up in the area, greeted me with his usual politeness. I asked to see if any deposits had been made in my account in the past week. He checked, then shook his head gently, saying there had been no recent changes. Whatever money had come from the sale had not passed through my hands. From the bank, I went straight to the county office. The woman behind the counter printed the transaction history for the property. She explained that the transfer had been processed electronically, with a digital notarization attached. I asked to see the original file. She slid it across the desk, the image of my supposed signature staring back at me. Underneath, the notary stamp glared in dark ink, accompanied by a date and time. The time caught my attention first. It was just after 8 in the evening on the same day as the yacht party. I thought back to that night, standing on my deck and watching the glow across the water. I had been here, on my property, not signing anything. The realization settled over me like cold rain. Someone had used an old copy of my signature, attaching it to a document I had never seen, while I stood outside looking toward a celebration I had not been invited to. By the time I left the county office, the fog had burned off, and the afternoon sun was bright against the pavement. The warmth did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. I drove home slowly, each turn of the road heavy with the knowledge that Tahoe Sunset was no longer legally mine. When I pulled into the drive, the first thing I noticed was the small change to the front porch. The wooden sign with the name of the house was gone. The hooks where it had hung for decades were empty, leaving 2 pale outlines on the siding. I stood there for a long moment before going inside. The air in the house felt different, thinner somehow, as though it had been marked by the knowledge that it belonged to someone else. I walked through each room, touching the edges of furniture, the backs of chairs, the frame of the doorway leading to the kitchen. Nothing had moved yet, but the sense of possession had shifted. Even the familiar creak of the floorboard by the hallway seemed less like a quirk and more like a goodbye. That night, I sat at the dining table with the documents spread out once more. The lamp cast a warm circle of light over the pages, highlighting each word that confirmed what I already knew. The house was gone, taken without my consent. The decision made in rooms I had not been invited into. I did not sleep much. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the lights of the yacht across the water and the name on that banner. I thought about the signatures, the date, the quiet efficiency with which everything had been done. And somewhere under the disbelief, there was a slow, steady ember of resolve beginning to burn. The call came late in the morning, just as I was rinsing the breakfast plates. Sloane's voice was clipped, polite, the way she spoke when she was arranging something rather than asking. She told me they wanted to have a family meeting at her house that afternoon. She did not say what it was about, but I knew. There was no mistaking the tone. That careful firmness that meant the decision had already been made, and I was expected to be there for appearances. The drive to her place was quiet. I kept the radio off, letting the hum of the tires fill the silence. Sloane and Graham's house sat on the edge of town, a new building with a perfect lawn and a wide porch that looked like it had been designed for magazine covers. It was a far cry from the worn wood and uneven stone of Tahoe Sunset. Inside, the air was cool with the faint scent of something citrus and sharp. Graham was standing near the fireplace, a folder in his hand. Veronica sat on the sofa, crossed legs angled just so, a crystal glass in front of her on the coffee table. Sloane appeared from the kitchen, a tight smile on her face as she gestured for me to sit. The moment I lowered myself into the armchair, Graham began. He talked about the upkeep of the house, the costs, the strain it might be putting on me. He spoke as if I were a figure on a spreadsheet, a problem to be resolved. He mentioned the offer they had received, how it was too good to pass up. Every sentence carried the weight of something already signed and sealed. I let him finish, my hands resting lightly on my knees. I could feel the grain of the chair's upholstery under my fingertips, grounding me in the moment. When he paused, I said only that the decision was never his to make. My eyes shifted to Sloane, but she kept her gaze on the rug. It was Veronica who leaned forward then, her smile warm, but edged with something sharper. She said the house had sentimental value for everyone, not just me. She reminded me, as if it were a kindness, that there were debts in life which could not be paid with words alone. Her voice softened as she said she knew my husband had done something extraordinary for her once, and that sometimes the right thing to do was to let go of what we think belongs to us. Her words landed heavy, not for their truth, but for their precision. She was choosing each one carefully, shaping them to sound noble, when in reality they were meant to erase the line between what was mine and what she wanted. I kept my expression still, though my chest tightened at the mention of my husband. Sloane shifted in her seat, reaching for a thin envelope on the table. She slid it toward me. Inside was a check, the kind you hand over for a service rendered, not for a home lost. The amount was a fraction of what the house was worth. She said it was to help with the transition, that she and Graham would handle moving anything I wanted to keep. Her voice trembled just enough to suggest she was not as certain as she wanted to appear. I placed the envelope back on the table without opening it. The room felt smaller, the air pressing in. Veronica's eyes followed the movement, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face as if she had expected this outcome. Graham cleared his throat, shifting the folder under his arm. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my cardigan. I told them I would make my own arrangements, that I did not need their help or their check. Sloane's mouth opened slightly, but she closed it again, her hands folding in her lap. On my way to the door, I felt the weight of all three of their gazes. It was not the weight of concern or regret, but the solid certainty of people who believed they had acted in the right. That certainty was more cutting than any argument could have been. The afternoon sun was bright when I stepped outside, the kind of light that should have warmed me but did not. I walked to my car, each step deliberate, the gravel shifting under my shoes. The drive back to the lake felt longer than usual. The water was calm when I arrived, the dock stretching into the stillness as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. I stood there for a long time, letting the quiet seep in. I thought about the way Veronica had spoken, about the way she had wrapped her claim in the language of gratitude and inevitability. I thought about Sloane's eyes fixed on the rug instead of on me, and about the check left unopened on her table. Inside the house, I moved through the rooms without switching on the lights. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching across the floorboards. In the living room, the sign for Tahoe Sunset still hung above the door, the wood warm under my hand. For the first time since we had put it up, it felt like a reminder rather than a welcome. That night, the air off the lake carried a chill. I sat at the kitchen table, The documents from the county spread out again in front of me. The conversation from earlier echoed in my mind, not in their exact words, but in the way they had been delivered. Calm, certain, final. I knew then that silence would only serve them. They were counting on me to accept what had been done, to step aside without pushing back. I was not ready to decide how I would respond, but I knew I would not let their version of events be the only one that existed. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a truck engine idling somewhere near the drive. The light outside was still soft, the air carrying the faint scent of pine needles warming in the early sun. I stepped onto the porch in my slippers and saw a moving van pulled up close to the garage. Two men in company shirts were lifting boxes from the back, stacking them neatly on a dolly. I walked down the steps, the gravel cool under my feet, and asked Wadbones where they were headed with my things. One of them glanced at a clipboard and told me they had been hired to move items marked for donation. I asked what items those were, and he gestured toward the garage. The door was open, and inside I could see a line of boxes stacked almost to the ceiling, each with a strip of masking tape across the top. On the tape, written in thick black marker, were the words "Misk, old stuff." The sight of it made my stomach tighten. I stepped into the garage, running my hand over the nearest box. The cardboard was worn in places, a faint mark of water damage near the bottom. I tore back the tape and opened it, expecting to see the mismatched dishes I kept meaning to give away. Instead, on top of a layer of packing paper, there was a framed photo of my husband standing beside the boat he had used the summer before he died. His smile was wide, the lake behind him glowing in the afternoon light. I set the photo aside and looked deeper. Beneath it were the holiday ornaments we had collected over the years, wrapped in scraps of newspaper dated decades ago. The next box held the quilt my mother made me when I was 19. Its colors faded but still bright in my memory. Another box held kitchen items I used weekly, the heavy mixing bowl that had belonged to my grandmother. None of this was clutter. None of it was meant to be given away. I called out to the men to stop loading, and they did, their faces caught between confusion and politeness. I told them these things were not to be donated, that they would be staying here until I decided otherwise. One of them nodded, checking his clipboard again before backing the dolly out of the garage. They left the boxes where they were, the open one with my husband's photograph resting on top, like a marker for everything else I feared had been lost. Once they drove away, I stayed in the garage for a long time, opening boxes one by one. Some were filled with books, others with kitchenware, but more than a few were missing items I knew should have been there. I looked for the leather-bound album that held our wedding photos, the one I kept on the lower shelf of the living room cabinet. It was not in any of the boxes. I checked the cabinet inside, then the bedroom, then every possible storage place I could think of. The album was gone. The loss of the house had been a sharp cut, but this felt like something slower, a theft that reached beyond walls and into the very fabric of my life. The missing album meant more than photographs. It was the one place where my husband's handwriting still lived in the margins, little notes he had made about the day or the people in the pictures. Without it, those details would fade in my mind. I sat on the garage step, the cool air curling around my ankles, and let my thoughts settle. This was not a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Someone had gone through my home, chosen what would stay and what would be removed, and labeled the pieces of my life as miscellaneous. Inside, the house felt different again. The air was lighter in the wrong way, as if space had been cleared not for comfort, but for absence. I moved through the rooms, noticing the empty spaces where familiar objects should have been. The ceramic bowl for my keys, the embroidered cushion from my reading chair, small treasures that stitched my daily life together were simply gone. I stopped in the living room, letting my eyes travel over the mantel. The framed photo of my husband and me standing on the dock was still there, but it had been shifted to one side. In its place was an empty spot, the dust disturbed just enough to leave a faint outline of something that had once been there. I could not recall what it was, which somehow made its absence feel worse. That evening, I took the boxes from the garage and stacked them in the spare bedroom. I could not bring myself to unpack them yet, but I needed them close, where I could see they were still mine. I left the box with my husband's photograph open on the top of the stack. The image of him by the boat caught the last light of the day, his eyes holding that mix of calm and mischief I had loved so much. As night fell, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where the album should have been. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wood settling. I thought of the men loading the truck that morning, their easy movements, the way they had been given permission to take what they wanted from my life. I knew then that this was not just about the sale of the house. This was about erasing pieces of me, shifting the story of who I was into something smaller, more manageable, something they could control. It was a kind of loss that crept in without warning, leaving you to discover it one missing thing at a time. I went to bed with the window open, letting the sound of the lake fill the room. In the darkness, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would keep track of every missing piece, every item taken without my consent. The house might be gone in name, but the proof of what had been done was still here, scattered in the gaps they had left behind. The following Saturday, the walking group met at the trailhead near the North Shore, where the air carried the smell of damp earth and cedar. I had almost skipped it, not in the mood for small talk or the easy rhythm of neighbors catching up. But Joni had called the night before, insisting I come, saying fresh air was better than sitting in a house filled with boxes I could not bring myself to unpack. The trail wound along the edge of the lake before climbing into a stretch of evergreens. The sound of water followed us, soft and steady, like a reminder of where we had started. Walter Pike fell into step beside me about a mile in. His stride was measured, hands tucked behind his back when he wasn't pointing out a bird call or a track in the dirt. Walter had been a fixture in town for as long as I could remember, a man who approached conversation like he approached numbers, with patience, precision, and an ear for details most people missed. That morning, he asked how I was holding up, his voice low enough that it didn't carry to the others. I told him only that things had been unsettled. He nodded, and for a few paces we walked without speaking. Then he mentioned seeing unusual activity at my place earlier in the week. He had been out on his deck with his binoculars, watching for the early arrival of a flock of mergansers, when he noticed the moving truck. He asked if everything was all right with the sale. I told him there had been no sale as far as I was concerned, not one I had agreed to. His brow furrowed slightly, but he let it be, as though filing the information away for later. As we rounded a bend, the lake came into view again, a wide stretch of silver under the mid-morning sun. Walter slowed his pace, looking out over the water. He said the scene reminded him of a day many years back. The summer, a storm caught a group of boats off guard. He told it simply, as if describing a change in the weather, but I could hear the weight in his voice. A sudden squall had rolled in from the west, and one of the smaller boats had gone over, throwing its passengers into the water. I felt the skin along my arms tighten before he even finished. He said he remembered the rescue well. One man had gone in after a woman struggling to stay above the waves. That man had managed to get her to the dock where others pulled her in, but he had never come back up. Walter's eyes stayed on the horizon as he spoke. He said he believed my husband had been that man, and that the woman was Veronica Bennett. The air between us shifted. I told him I knew my husband had drowned helping someone that day, but I had never known for certain who it was. Walter nodded. His mouth set in a line that suggested there was more he could say. He told me he had seen Veronica the next week in town, standing in front of her salon with a cigarette in one hand and a glass in the other, smiling like nothing had happened. The image had stuck with him all these years. We kept walking, the conversation moving to other things, but my mind stayed anchored to that story. The lake felt different now, its surface hiding more than water. I thought of Veronica in Sloane's living room, her calm voice, her words about debts and letting go. I had taken them as manipulation before. Now I began to wonder if they were something else too, some twisted way of rewriting a history she could not escape. When we reached the observation deck halfway up the trail, Walter pulled a small notebook from his jacket. It was the kind of pocket ledger he was known for carrying, pages filled with his neat block handwriting. He flipped through until he found a date, then turned it toward me. It was from that summer decades ago, the day of the storm. He had recorded the time the wind shifted, the boats he saw heading in, and the one that never returned. The entry ended with my husband's name, underlined once. I ran my finger lightly over the page, the paper soft from years of being turned. Walter said he kept notes like that on most things. Old habit from his years as an auditor. Facts, times, names. They stayed clear when feelings got messy. He offered to make me a copy if I wanted. I told him I did. The rest of the group caught up then, and the easy chatter of neighbors filled the space between us. But the ledger stayed in my mind as we made our way back down the trail. It was proof of something, even if I wasn't yet sure how to use it. By the time we reached the parking lot, the sun had risen high enough to burn away the last of the morning haze. Walter handed me a folded slip of paper with his phone number written at the top, and a note that he'd drop by the library next week with the copy. His eyes held the kind of steady patience that told me he was not offering help out of pity, but out of respect for the truth. Driving home, I kept seeing the water closing over my husband's head, the way Walter must have remembered it. The image mixed with the sight of Veronica on that yacht, her smile lit by party lights. The years between those two moments collapsed into something sharp. When I reached the house, I stood for a moment on the deck, looking out at the lake. The breeze carried the faint smell of sap from the pines, and somewhere a loon called. I thought about the ledger, about the dates and times written in Walter's careful hand, and about how some things, no matter how long they stay buried, find their way to the surface again. The library smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, a scent that always made me think of the hours I had spent here as a younger woman, shelving books in exchange for the kind of calm you cannot buy. Now, the calm felt different, heavier, as though the air itself knew I was not here for pleasure. Walter had kept his word. 2 days after our walk, I found an envelope in my mailbox, his careful handwriting across the front. Inside was a photocopy of the ledger page and a short note saying he believed there might be more in the town archives. It was enough to push me past the hesitation that had been slowing my steps. The archives were tucked behind the main stacks, in a room where the carpet had worn thin along the paths most often walked. Mrs. Larkin, the head librarian, looked up from her desk when I came in, her glasses sliding down her nose. She had known me for decades, and in her quiet way, she understood the difference between casual curiosity and a search weighted with purpose. I explained that I was looking for records from the summer of the storm, specifically anything related to boating accidents or emergency calls. She led me to a wall of bound ledgers and rolled out a narrow ladder. Together we pulled down the volumes from that year, each one thick with the neat looping script of clerks long gone. Hours passed in the small hum of turning pages. Most entries were mundane: permits for fishing, notices about dock repairs, a parade schedule. Then, in the middle of July, The script shifted slightly, the ink darker, the words closer together. There it was, a report of a fatal incident on the lake during an unexpected squall. The victim, Daniel Hart, had gone into the water attempting to assist a capsized boat. 2 passengers were rescued. Names were listed, and one of them was Veronica Bennett. I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling the paper's faint ridges under my skin. There was no embellishment, no note about the man's family, just the plain record of what had happened. Mrs. Larkin stood quietly beside me until I closed the ledger. She asked if I wanted a photocopy for my files. I told her yes. The photocopiers filled the silence, and I noticed how the light from the high windows shifted as the afternoon slid toward evening. Holding the copy in my hands, I felt the weight of it in a way I had not expected. This was not a story told over coffee or a memory shaped by time. It was fact, stamped and preserved in the town's own history. Before leaving, I asked if there were any photographs from that summer. Mrs. Larkin led me to a cabinet filled with labeled envelopes. We found one marked simply July events. Inside were faded prints of a regatta, children in swimsuits, and a few snapshots of storm clouds over the lake. In the corner of one photo, almost hidden by the grain, I could see a small boat listing to one side, figures barely visible against the water. It was not proof in the way the ledger was, but it pulled something tight in my chest. On my way out, I passed the bulletin board near the entrance. Among the flyers for yard sales and choir rehearsals was a notice for an estate auction scheduled for the following month. My eyes caught on the name at the bottom, Veronica Bennett. The list of items was brief, but one line stood out. Vintage nautical chart, framed. I thought of the yacht party, of her standing on the deck with that same calm smile, and wondered what else she might have kept from those years. The walk back to my car felt longer than it was. The streets were quiet, the shops along Main already pulling in their awnings for the night. I unlocked the door and sat for a moment, the copy of the ledger page resting on the passenger seat. The lake was not in view here, but I could feel it anyway, steady and unbothered, holding the stories of everyone who had lived along its shore. Driving home, I thought of Sloane and how quickly she had moved to take the house from me. I thought of Veronica's name, first on the rescue list, now on an auction flyer. The threads between these events were tightening, even if I could not yet see the full pattern. When I pulled into my driveway, the light over the porch clicked on, washing the steps in pale yellow. I carried the papers inside and laid them on the table, smoothing the edges until they were perfectly flat. Then I sat back and let the quiet of the house settle around me, not as comfort, but as space to think. The ledger, the photographs, the auction notice, they were pieces, and I had always been good at puzzles. The community center had been dressed up for the occasion, though no one would mistake it for one of the sleek city auction houses. Rows of folding chairs faced a makeshift stage where tables displayed the items up for sale. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the tang of old wood polish. I arrived early enough to watch the crowd trickle in, each person holding the slim catalog they had picked up at the door. Mine was folded in half, my eyes returning again and again to the listing for the framed nautical chart. The chart was placed toward the center of the display, the frame worn but sturdy, the paper inside slightly yellowed with age. Even from a distance, I could see the delicate ink lines tracing the lake's shape, the tiny notations of depth and hazard. It was the sort of object that carried both beauty and history, something meant to hang where people could study it slowly. I wondered how it had come to be in Veronica's possession at all. People milled about, murmuring in low voices, pointing at items, scribbling notes. I stayed near the back, content to watch. A cluster of women I recognized from town stood near a table of crystal vases, talking with the kind of eager energy that comes from knowing everyone in the room. Then I saw her, Veronica. She was standing near the stage, speaking to the auctioneer, her hands moving gracefully as if every word she spoke was part of a performance. She wore a pale blue jacket, and her hair was swept back neatly, the same composed elegance she had carried at the yacht party. Her gaze swept the room once, briefly, but I was sure she did not expect to see me here. I stayed still, letting the hum of conversation mask the quiet thrum in my chest. She moved away from the stage and began greeting people, shaking hands, leaning in to exchange a few words. It was as if she had slipped into a role she had played all her life, and the audience was more than willing to accept it. When the auction began, the room settled into a rhythm. Items moved quickly, the auctioneer's voice steady, coaxing bids from the crowd. I listened to numbers rise and fall, watched hands lift, saw the occasional triumphant nod when the gavel came down. I waited, my attention narrowing each time we moved closer to the chart's lot number. Finally, it was placed on the stand. The auctioneer gave a brief description, his voice lifting just enough to suggest this was something special. A man in the second row opened with the first bid, and almost immediately a woman across the aisle countered. The numbers climbed in measured steps. I kept my face still, my hands folded in my lap, until the room hesitated at a pause. Then I raised my hand. The auctioneer nodded in my direction and announced the new figure. Heads turned, some curious, others calculating. The man in the second row glanced back at me, then shook his head slightly when the auctioneer sought his response. The woman across the aisle hesitated, her lips pressed tight, then lifted her hand again. It went back and forth for another few rounds. I could feel Veronica's eyes on me now, though I kept mine fixed on the chart. The bid slowed, and when I offered my final number, the woman across the aisle lowered her gaze. The gavel fell, and the chart was mine. I stood when they called my number to settle payment, moving to the side table where receipts were written by hand. The clerk spoke politely, sliding the paperwork toward me along with a claim ticket. I could sense movement beside me and turned just enough to see Veronica standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, simply watched as I signed the papers. With the claim ticket in hand, I crossed to the table where the items were being released. A volunteer lifted the chart carefully, wrapping it in brown paper before handing it to me. The weight of it in my arms was less than I expected, yet it carried something heavier than the frame and glass could explain. Outside, the evening had cooled. I walked slowly to my car, each step measured, aware of the quiet following me out of the building. When I reached the driver's side, I turned to see Veronica standing at the doorway, her arms crossed loosely, her gaze still fixed in my direction. There was no wave, no nod, just that steady look before she turned back inside. I placed the chart gently across the back seat and closed the door. The drive home passed in silence, the streetlights casting long pools of gold across the pavement. Once inside, I unwrapped the chart and set it on the dining table. My eyes traced the ink lines again, noting the small hand-drawn markings in the lower corner, initials so faint they could be missed entirely. They were Daniel's. I sat at the table long after the house had gone still, the chart spread before me under the glow of the lamp. My fingers traced the faint initials again, feeling the indentation in the paper where the pen had pressed years ago. Daniel had marked this himself, not as a sailor's note, but as a private signature. It was proof that the chart had been ours, that it had hung on the wall in the lake house before Veronica ever set foot inside. Memories began to string themselves together in my mind. I remembered Daniel studying this chart on quiet evenings, his reading glasses slipping down his nose. He would lean in close, murmuring about hidden coves and currents that shifted with the wind. Seeing his mark there now was like hearing his voice again, low and steady, telling me to look closer. I pulled out a folder from the sideboard where I kept old photographs. There it was, a picture of Daniel standing in the living room of the lake house, the chart on the wall behind him. His hand rested on the frame, his wedding ring catching the light. In the corner of the photo, a reflection in the glass showed a younger me, holding a tray of coffee. That image was more than nostalgia. It was evidence. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped by the small law office on Main Street. I had known Albert, the senior partner, for years, though we hadn't spoken much since Daniel passed. I laid the photo on his desk without explanation. He studied it for a long moment, then looked at me with that careful stillness lawyers have when they sense a fight coming. I told him about the sale of the lake house, about the yacht party, about finding the chart. His jaw tightened as I spoke. He asked if I wanted to make this official. I told him I wanted it documented, in a way that no one could twist. He nodded, pulled a form from his drawer, and began writing. When I left the office, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I wasn't rushing toward anything, but I wasn't standing still anymore either. 2 days later, I drove out toward the lake. The property sat quiet, the water lapping gently against the dock. From the road, I could see the new owner had made changes. Fresh paint on the siding, new Adirondack chairs lined up facing the water. But the soul of the place was the same. I parked down the hill and walked the narrow path Daniel and I had worn over years of weekends. My shoes sank slightly into the damp earth. I paused at the edge of the property, not stepping onto the deck, just letting my eyes take in the view. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from somewhere farther down the shore. My gaze shifted to a boat moored in the distance. Even from here, I could tell it was the same yacht from the party, Veronica's yacht. She must have spotted me, because minutes later, she appeared on the deck of the lake house. She stood very still for a moment, then descended the steps slowly, her face set in a calm that felt practiced. I didn't move. She came close enough that I could see the faint shimmer of lipstick, the small gold pendant at her neck. We exchanged only a few quiet words, the kind that sound polite on the surface but carry barbs underneath. She made a remark about how change was inevitable, how memories could live anywhere if one let them. I said nothing, but my hand rested on my bag where the photograph and chart were tucked safely inside. When I left, she remained on the deck, watching me go. I didn't look back until I reached the car, and when I did, she had turned toward the lake, her figure framed by the afternoon light. The summer festival in town was always a crowded affair, full of booths, music, and the smell of fried food drifting through the streets. I hadn't planned on attending, but Albert had asked me to meet him there. He had arranged for the Historical Society to display artifacts from the lake's past, and among them was the nautical chart. It hung in the center of the display, unwrapped, its details visible to everyone passing by. Beside it was the enlarged photograph of Daniel, with a small placard explaining its provenance. People stopped to study it, leaning in to read the description, tracing the lines on the map with their eyes. I stood back, blending into the crowd. At some point, Veronica arrived. She was with a small group, laughing at something one of them had said, but her expression shifted the moment she saw the display. Her steps slowed. She read the placard, her face still, and then she turned, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on me. I didn't approach her, and she didn't come to me. Instead, she lingered by the chart for a while, then left without a word. The moment felt less like a confrontation and more like a quiet declaration. The chart was no longer hers to hide. Weeks passed, and the legal matters moved forward quietly. The paperwork Albert had filed ensured the sale of the lake house would be reviewed. Veronica sent no word, made no gesture toward reconciliation. That was fine. I wasn't seeking an apology from her. One evening, as summer tipped toward autumn, I took the chart down from its temporary place on my wall and carried it out to the porch. The sun was setting over the hills, the lake in the distance catching the last light. I sat with it across my lap, my fingers resting lightly on the frame. It wasn't about the property anymore. It was about the truth of what Daniel and I had built together, and the quiet certainty that no one could rewrite it. The lake house might stand under someone else's name now, but the life we had there remained untouched in my memory, anchored in the lines of this map. I thought about the years I had chosen silence, believing it would keep the peace. I realized now that silence had only ever served those who wished to speak over me. In the soft dusk, with the weight of the chart steady in my hands, I felt something loosen inside. The water in the distance was calm, the surface broken only by the glide of a single boat heading toward the far shore. I watched until it became a small shadow against the darkening sky. Then I rose, carried the chart back inside, and closed the door. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.